Today we are going to continue working on section 3.5. Today we are actually going to be graphing our lines using slope-intercept form. Which means we need to know what slope-intercept form looks like. Okay, so what we need to know, it's written a little small, so I'll write it a little bigger off to the side, is that slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b, where m represents our slope and b represents our y-intercept. Now, we've talked about the y-intercept before. Now we're just giving it a name. We will use the letter b to refer to the y-intercept. So I would have the title of slope-intercept form, and I would have the slope-intercept form equation in my notes. I would know, yep, and I would know that slope is the letter m. We talked about that yesterday, and b represents our y-intercept. Okay, down at the bottom, we've got the constant function of when we have a zero slope. We've already looked at that. That's when we have a horizontal line. That is not new to us. If you want to rewrite it, you can. That y equals b or y equals a number is a horizontal line. But we've covered that in another section. So from these, we are just identifying the slope and the y-intercept of each linear equation. So slope, what letter did we say we use for slope? M. What about the y-intercept? B. So for each one of these, I want to know what m equals and what b equals. Now, we know m and b pretty easily as long as we are in slope-intercept form. That's what we were looking at on the previous slide. That's when y equals mx plus b. If it's in that form, we just have to pluck out the numbers we want. So, for example, on letter A, what number is in the m slot? 3. What about the number in the B slot? 3 and -4. Who was able to figure out M and B on letter C? Sorry, B. M and B on letter B. What do you think, Dominic?
There is no slope on B.
Very good. So M would equal? 6. Nope. 0. Remember, a horizontal line, or y equals a number, has a slope of 0.
So 6.5 is the y-intercept?
Yep, 6.5 would be the y-intercept or the b.
So if it was an x right there, 6.5 would be the slope?
No. If there was an x there, so this is a good question. Let's look at that down at the bottom. If it were x equals 6.5, an x equals line looks like what?
No, I'm talking about it was y equals 6.5.
Oh, 6.5x. Then yes, you're right. Then yes, that would be the slope and 0 would be the y-intercept. Yep, let's talk about this though, because this is another good example to talk about. If we have x equals a number, what does our line look like? Y equals is horizontal, x equals is vertical. And what kind of slope does a vertical line have? It does go up and down. The line goes up and down. But what kind of slope is that? We identified that yesterday. What is it, Lydia? Undefined. So in this case, m is undefined. And a line that goes straight up and down is usually not going to touch the y-axis at all. So there is no y-intercept. So an x equals line is a special type of situation. I don't know that we'll see that a whole lot, but it's worth mentioning. Slope would be undefined and there would not be a y-intercept most of the time. Other questions before we move on? Do you have a question? What's different about letter C? Hunter?
It's totally switched up. It's like 3/4 pounds like on the other side of that problem.
Good. We don't have it in slope-intercept form. It's all switched around on us. So in order to have it in slope-intercept form, we are going to have to change things around. We need it to look like y equals mx plus b. What do you think the first thing that's got to go is? I would move the negative 5x. There are a couple different ways you could do this. I think that getting rid of the x term would help. How are we going to make that disappear from this side? Add 5x. But if we do it to one side, we better do it to the other side. If I cancel out those 5x's, what do I still have on the left side? A negative y. Now this time I'm going to put my 5x first, and it is positive. What comes after the 5x? A negative 2 or a minus 2. Are we okay with rearranging it that way? Okay? So then after that, we've got to decide, is it in slope-intercept form yet? Not quite. What still needs to go? The negative sign. How do we get rid of a negative sign in front of that y?
You add y.
Nope. Divide by what? Close. Negative 1. And if we divide that by negative 1, we divide everything by a negative 1. When we do that, our y turns positive. What happens to our 5x? It goes negative. And what about our minus 2? Becomes a plus 2. So sometimes you might have to change it to be in slope-intercept form. The y should be alone, equals your x term, and then if you have one, your constant at the very end. Now that we've switched it all around, it should be pretty easy to identify m and b. What is our slope? And our y-intercept? Positive 2. Questions about letter C? Okay. Next up in our notes, we need to write down the steps of how we would graph from slope-intercept form. Step 1 is to make sure that it is in slope-intercept form, like we just did on that letter C. Then we find the slope in the y-intercept. We've also just practiced doing that. Third step is to plot the y-intercept. That means put that point on your graph and then use your slope, rise over run, to find another point or sometimes a couple more points. We are going to graph these using slope-intercept form, and then after it is graphed, we are going to also identify the x-intercept. If you grabbed graph paper, now would be a good time to have that handy.
Where is he?
The graph paper? It's up by the note paper. I try to set them both out when I know we're going to need it. Our first step, if needed, we have to rewrite it in slope-intercept form. So, is this in slope-intercept form? Yes, this is in the form y equals mx plus b. So that first part is really done for us. So then we need to identify our slope, or m, and our y-intercept b. What is our slope? 4. If I wanted to write that as a fraction, how could I write it?
4
4 over 1. It might be helpful to get in the habit of writing your slopes as a fraction. What about our y-intercept, or our b? -4. Next thing we have to do is graph our y-intercept, or plot the y-intercept. Now, if you're unsure of that, you could think about your y-intercept as a point. Remember when we listed our x and y-intercepts? For the y-intercept, we plugged 0 in for x, and then we used that number for our y, whatever number we found. So, where am I going to find my y-intercept of -4 on our graph?
It's gonna be right there. Like, you gotta go down 4.
Down 4, good. Start at the origin, go down 4. That is how we plot our y-intercept. On your y-axis, go to that number. Put a point there. Next, we have to use our slope as rise over run to get another point or to get more points. So if my rise is +4, what direction am I going? Up. Rise is positive, we go up. So we would go up 4, and then our run is a +1. So am I going to go left or right? Right 1. So rise over run. We could do that again. So from this point, we could go up 4 and to the right 1 and get another point. We could continue finding more points using our rise and our run. We can keep going up 4 to the right 1, up 4 to the right 1. You need as many points as you can get on a graph is best. You need at least how many points to make a line? 2. Bare minimum 2 points. I prefer 3. I like to put as many as I can on my graphs just to make sure that I've got a nice straight line. And then we go ahead and put a line through those points. On our most recent quest, some people put points on a graph and then never actually graphed their line. Okay, you're going to be losing points for that if you keep doing that. We actually need our line graphed through those points. Questions about how we got our graph? Okay, the last part asks us to identify the x-intercept. So that's the point where the line crosses the x-axis. Does anybody see where that happens? Liam?
0, 1, or 1, 0.
1, 0, good. So when we crossed our x-axis, that's the axis that goes through the middle left and right, that point right there is where our line hit it, so that's the point 1, 0. Now, we didn't need the graph to find the x-intercept. We could have found it from our equation like we did on the last quiz. Plug 0 in for y, solve for x. But it should be easy to identify your x-intercepts once you have it graphed. Questions before we do the next one? Janiyah. Okay.
Wait, yeah. On my worksheets.
Next one to graph. We switch slides. I should see pencils moving on paper. Step 1. Is it in slope-intercept form? No. It is not y equals mx plus b yet, so we have to change it.
You gotta subtract 2x.
Good. To make it slope-intercept form, we need to move the 2x. That means we have to subtract it. So now we would have y equals, what is the correct way to write the right side? -2x plus 2. Good. We cannot combine those. They are not like terms. One has an x, one does not. We need the x term to go first with its sign. So the 2x was negative, and then that 2 was positive. Now that it's in slope-intercept form, we should be able to identify m and b. What is my m? -2. As a fraction, it would be -2/1. What about my b? A +2. Questions on identifying m and b? The next thing we have to do is actually start graphing some points. The first point we should graph is our y-intercept. Where do we find our y-intercept on this graph? Up 2. So on our y-axis at +2. Then we use our slope as rise over run to get more points. If my rise is -2, where should I be going from my starting point? Down 2. That 1 is positive, so I go which way? To the right 1. Down 2, right 1. Now, if my graph were too small to be able to go down and to the right, I can reverse my directions. Meaning that 2 over a -1 is still equal to a -2. So instead of going down and right, where could I go instead? If that rise was positive, I'd go which way? Up and to the left, and I'm still going to be on that same line. Okay, so if you have a negative, it could go with your rise or it could go with your run, and it's still going to be the same slope. It'll still give you points on that same line. So we graph our line through those points. Last step is to identify our x-intercept. Where does it happen again? Yep, where we cross the x-axis. What point is that? At 1, 0. So it's the same place that it was last time, just a different line. When this line is written in slope-intercept form, what does it look like? Anna? Very good. Y equals -3x minus 3. We have to subtract the 3x from both sides. We make sure our x term goes in front of our constant. They're both negatives. Questions about slope-intercept form? Okay, next we need to know our m and our b. What are they? Liam?
Our m is -3.
And our b?
-3.
Also -3. Again, if you want your slope as a fraction, you can put your -3/1, or you could make it 3 over -1. Those are all equal to each other. They all equal a -3. When we start graphing, we need to graph what first? Not our slope first. The y-intercept comes first, or b comes first. So where would we find a y-intercept of -3? Where? Down 3 from the origin. We have a y-intercept. Then we use our slope to get more points. Now you can choose if you want to make your rise the negative number, or if you want to make the run the negative number, but you only have one negative, so they can't both go negative directions at the same time. If we use negative 3 over 1, then our rise is negative, so where would I go from my starting point? Down 3, and then my run is positive 1, so I would go which direction? To the right one. If instead I want to make my rise a positive 3, I would go which way? Up 3, and then my run is negative, so I go left 1. Oop, yeah. Okay, and we could keep going up 3, left 1 a couple more times to get some more points. Make sure you're only using one negative sign, though. If you use 2 negatives, that's like having a positive. Oop, that one got a little off. There we go. Make sure your lines are going through your graph and that you're putting arrows on your ends to show that it does keep going on and on and on. Last step for this problem is to identify our x-intercept. What is it? One person said it. Negative 1, comma, 0. So our x-intercept this time is over here. That's negative 1, comma, 0. Questions on example 4. Okay, we've got one more we got to get through. This one takes a little bit more work to get in slope-intercept form. I should see everybody writing it down in case we have a problem like this tomorrow. Okay, we need it in slope-intercept form. So what needs to move first? The x. To move it, we would subtract it on both sides. So right now we have 2y equals what? Negative x plus 6. Are we in slope-intercept form yet? No, what do we still need to get rid of? The 2 in front of the y. How are we going to get rid of it? By dividing. Every single piece gets divided by that 2. Okay, so now we have y equals. What number could I put in front of the x? Nope, a 1 could go right in front of it. So this would be negative 1 over 2x. You can put the x right by the negative 1, or you can put it a little off to the side of the fraction. What about 6 divided by 2? 3. Now we're in slope-intercept form, so I can identify my m and my b. What is my m? Negative 1/2, and my b is 3. Where do I start this graph? 3 on the y-axis. So where do I go to get there? Up 3. Then I use my slope. Negative 1/2 tells me to go where? Down 1, right 2 is an option. Down 1, right 2. Or instead of down and to the right, I could go where? Up and to the left. So up 1, left 2. Up 1, left 2. Either way, we should get some points on our graph so we can put our line through them. Last thing we need to do is identify our x-intercept. So it looks like we had a point on our x-intercept all the way over here. That is a positive 6. So that point is 6, 0.